Well, friends, hello to you, and thank you for joining me on this October 23rd Bible study on Ecclesiastes chapter 7 and 8. By the time many of you view this video, I will have just returned from some traveling in Michigan and Missouri, and in preparation for those travels, I'm here in the sanctuary to record this video lecture. It's certainly not the same as when we gather together either in the sanctuary or on Zoom, but at least we can continue our study, our learning, and our reflection while I'm away. Coming to the 7th and 8th chapters of Ecclesiastes, I want to set the tone for this Bible study. Whereas in the past, we've gone through chapters verse by verse, these two chapters we're going to broaden out and consider the various concepts that we find in them. Another way of putting it, we're taking off the zoom lens of the camera and putting on the wide angle lens. So I just wanted to make that note, as well as the fact that throughout this study, I will be using the Jewish Publication Society's version of the Hebrew Bible. So as I read them, they may sound a little bit different than the Bibles you have at home, but that's one of the perks of Bible study, is to compare and to contrast the translations we read from. So as we come to chapters 7 and 8 of Ecclesiastes, it would appear to be the most depressing chapter yet. Admittedly, when I read through chapter 7, I groaned inwardly and thought about skipping over it entirely. And maybe you did too. Maybe as you were reading it, you thought, do we really have to go through this? It doesn't help that when we look at this passage in other translations, particularly in the New Revised Standard Version, we find those section headers. And they include words like disillusioned and riddles. There is no question that chapters 7 and 8 are perplexing. But the more I sat down with it, read these chapters carefully, and studied them, the more I fell in love with them. I know it appears depressing and despairing and discombobulating, but what we find is Kohelet, the Jewish wisdom sage, joining his heart, mind, and pen with his own conventional Jewish wisdom tradition's style of writing. Now, if you recall, Jewish wisdom tradition understood wisdom to be an extant body of truth that is outside of us, that is external to us. It's something that we seek after, and when we find it, we imbibe it and embrace it. We apply wisdom to our lives, and thus we are wise. That's what conventional wisdom taught. But as we considered, Kohelet challenges that convention. He says that through our own abilities to discern, to observe, and to reason, all that is necessary for wisdom rests within us already. But what I love in chapter 7 is that he conveys this truth to us by using conventional Jewish wisdom writing style. And there is value and merit in it. And more so, it was a style that his original audience would know best. The 7th chapter is made up of a series of powerful and practical maxims. And it reads much like a chapter right out of the book of Proverbs, for example. There are quick bursts of truth, and all of them are derived from Kohelet's observed observations. But for as practical as they are, the real power is at the end of them. He concludes, after he tells these series of truths, that they are of limited value. Verses 23 and 24 of chapter 7 tell us, "All this I tested with wisdom. I thought I could fathom it, but it eludes me. The secret of what happens is elusive and deep. Deep down, who can discover it?" Herein lies Kohelet's true wisdom. For nearly 24 verses, he gives us his truth, maxim after maxim, but in the end, he acknowledges that his own truth is limited. He cannot fathom everything. Wisdom, knowledge, and truth are elusive to him and to us all. It is a potent realization for Kohelet and for us if we dare to accept it. True wisdom acknowledges that none of us possesses all of the answers. None of us have a monopoly on truth or God or salvation. True wisdom begins and ends with our asking more questions than providing more answers. Note that Kohelet ends this section with a question. The secret of what happens is elusive and deep. Deep down, who can discover it? You know, religion and religious people would do well to learn to ask more questions than to spew out answers. Maybe that way it would possess more integrity in a growing irreligious world. A lot of people I know are not hungry for answers. They are hungry for meaning. They are hungry for safe spaces to discern life's difficult questions and to arrive at the answers on their own, or not, rather than having everything force-fed to them. I love what the writer and playwright Archibald MacLeish once said, "Religion is at its best when it makes us ask hard questions of ourselves. It is at its worst when it deludes us into thinking we have all the answers for everybody else." So while Kohelet speaks his own truth, he does not delude himself into thinking his truth or his answers are for everyone else. And so it must be for all of us. So what about those truths? Turning to verse 1 of chapter 7, these opening verses really do nothing to encourage us. A good name is better than fragrant oil, and the day of death is better than the day of birth. What a way to start. Why would Kohelet start with such despairing words? It doesn't stop there either. He continues, "It is better to go to a house of mourning than to a house of feasting, for that is the end of every person, and a living one should take it to heart. The birth of a new baby is something we celebrate, while the death of a person we love is something we grieve and mourn. Why would mourning and grieving be preferred to celebration?" Remember that for Kohelet, life is filled with moments, hevel, absurdities and futilities that are meaningless. Chapter 3 tells us that we move along the cycles and patterns of life, filled with wonderful things, yet also filled with its fair share of chasing after wind. What's more is that for Kohelet, death is the natural end of all of these cycles, hevel moments and wind chasing. As we considered a few weeks ago, death is not an enemy here, but it is no friend either. Death is a natural cause and a natural end, nothing more, nothing less, and it is to be embraced as such. We have heard his observations and warnings in chapters 5 and 6. With all of the oppression, envy, loneliness, relationships, politics, economics, and evils, there is much instability with which we must contend in this lifetime. And for many of us, that instability bests us rather than the other way around. It gets the best of us sometimes, doesn't it? And until a person dies, there is always danger that they may forfeit their good name. Many of us maybe know examples where people live long, full lives. They are admired by many. And yet when they near the end of their lives or after they are gone, deep and dark secret truths begin to emerge about them. Sadly, their good name and reputation slowly erodes. And while it doesn't undo all of the good they accomplished in their lifetime, they are overshadowed by the evils they did too, and that we are now knowledgeable of. I'm mindful of my own family in this. I never knew my great-grandfather, but he died young, and many people who knew him would agree that he was a good man at heart. He had trouble in his life, as do many others, but deep down he was a good man. But when he passed away, my family was going through his belongings, and buried under a pile of clothes in his dresser drawer was that unmistakable robe and hood. My great-grandfather was a member of the Ku Klux Klan, and his family didn't know. Whenever my great-grandfather comes up in conversation, memories are shared, yes, but that dark truth always finds a way to come up in the conversation. You know, in much the same way, life itself is made up of good and evil is really nothing more than the absence of good. Mourning and merrymaking, vexation and revelry, reproof and praise all make their way into life. And woven into Jewish pattern and culture are times for mourning and times for celebration. One of my pastoral colleagues once said that one thing the church does not know how to do very well is grieve, and the other is celebrate. You know, as a pastor, I love walking with families through their final goodbyes to a loved one after they die. And oftentimes when I minister to the dying or with their families immediately following death, one of the things I am frequently told is, we don't want a funeral. We want a celebration of life. Now, pastoral sensitivity and understanding always rules the day. But as we begin to plan the service, I like to remind the family that even though they may want a celebration of life, there is still loss that is experienced. And there should be a time and a space to collectively grieve and mourn that loss. We need that in our lives. We can't squelch grief and mourning with celebration. Ecclesiastes tells us there's a time for mourning and a time for dancing, a time for celebration. And it's important that we keep both as part of the spiritual life. As we continue to read Kohelet's truths, we also notice that there are blaring contradictions. For example, in 7:3, he praises vexation, saying, "Vexation is better than revelry, for though the face be sad, the heart may be glad. But in verse 9, he says, don't let your spirit be quickly vexed, for vexation abides in the breasts of fools. Vexation is preferred to revelry, he says, but vexation abides in the breasts of fools. What's going on here? Now, as you follow along at home in your Bibles, you may notice that your translations may be very different than what I just read. For example, the NRSV glosses over these contradictions by using different vocabulary to translate the recurring word in these verses. Verse 3 in the NRSV says, sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of countenance the heart is made glad. Verse 9, do not be quick to anger, for anger lodges in the bosom of fools. So biblical translation here is an art. It's not a science. There is no such thing as a perfect translation of the Bible, nor is there such a thing as a literal translation of the Bible. Every translation possesses interpretive influence by the ones doing the translating, and here we see that influence arising to gloss over some contradictions. But it doesn't allow us to wrestle with a contradiction that is blaring and evident in the text. Let's take a step back and consider an even broader view. Last week, in chapters 5 and 6, we saw how Kohelet was extremely critical of the idea of kingship or monarchy. He was also critical of the undivided trust people place in political and economic systems, and how those systems often favor a privileged few at the expense of others. But in chapter 8, Kohelet marks obedience to the king as a hallmark of wisdom. Verses 2 to 5 of chapter 8. Obey the king's orders. Don't rush into an oath by God. Leave his presence. Do not tarry in a dangerous situation, for he can do anything he pleases. Inasmuch as a king's command is authoritative, and none can say to him, "What are you doing?" One who obeys orders will not suffer in the dangerous situation. Of course, we could try to smooth over this contradiction by acknowledging that political and economic systems are necessary. They might be a necessary evil, but they're necessary just the same. So we should just accept it as our lot in life and spend our lives participating in them and making the best of them while we do. But Kohelet doesn't let us do that. He calls us to acknowledge that life is full of contradictions. It causes us to pause and to consider, can two very different, contradictory truths be equally valid? And I believe Kohelet is telling us that they can. In our search for wisdom, knowledge, and meaning, if we wait for every one of life's contradictions to be resolved, then we will never find wisdom. Wisdom acknowledges the various contradictions in life while also seeing the value that can be in them and in the truths they may possess. Two opposing ideas can be equally true, and we can benefit from both of them. Switching gears now to reflect further on the nature of God in chapters 7 and 8. Kohelet returns to a reflection upon God's nature and God's ways. First, we see that Kohelet believes God to be involved in maybe even the cause of human suffering, or at least God allows human suffering. 7:13 to 14. Consider God's doing, Who can straighten what God has twisted? So in a time of good fortune, enjoy the good fortune, and in a time of misfortune, reflect. The one no less than the other was God's doing. Consequently, humanity may find no fault with God. Second, Kohelet reemphasizes the inscrutability of God's ways, specifically in chapter 8. He gives special attention to an apparent delay in justice being rendered to evildoers. He writes, beginning in verse 11, and here is another frustration. The fact that the sentence imposed for evil deeds is not executed swiftly, which is why people are emboldened to do evil. The fact that a sinner may do evil 100 times and their punishment still be delayed. For although I am aware that it will be well with those who revere God, since they revere him, and it will not be well with the scoundrel, and they will not live long because they do not revere God, here is a frustration that occurs in the world. Sometimes an upright man is requited according to the conduct of a scoundrel, and sometimes the scoundrel is requited according to the conduct of the upright. I say, all that is frustration. And if we were honest, we would probably receive those words and respond with a hearty amen. There are times when justice is delayed or denied. We may recall the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous line from his letter from a Birmingham jail. He wrote, "Justice too long delayed is justice denied." Although we will never deny to serve a God of love, compassion, mercy, grace, and yes, justice, there are times when we will wonder in our heart of hearts, why don't some people get exactly what they deserve? Why does an innocent child, with their whole lives ahead of them, develop a terminal illness and die? While a downright boor can guzzle beer and smoke 2 packs of cigarettes a day and still live to be 95? Or more pointedly, how can a black man get pulled over and be the victim of police brutality and aggression when a white man gets pulled over for speeding and gets nothing more than a warning? Or when a white man commits a crime and gets probation, while a black man who commits a similar crime can spend years, if not the rest of his life, in prison? Where is the fairness? Where is the justice? Where is God? While there is much theological reflection and dialogue and debate over these assertions, we can come away with a deeper understanding that we do not always know or understand God's ways. God is God, and we are not. God is infinite, and we are finite. Certainly, trying to plunge the depths of the infinite knowledge of God's ways will only prove to vex our spirits quickly. This is one of the main reasons why I love being a United Methodist. In Methodism, John Wesley often emphasized the importance of the Christian disciples' cooperation with our gracious God. Rather than vex ourselves in trying to solve God's mysterious ways, faithfulness mandates our cooperation with both what we know God is doing and what God requires from us. Wesley contended this will lead to a deeper relationship with God and a more calm and contented faith. But such a contentment does not give us a license to sit back and to enjoy the good fortune we have been given while life under the sun continues to experience injustice, and justice both delayed and denied. It ought to inspire our action to confront injustice when it happens, for God's sake and for the sake of others, to create a just and more equitable world for all people. I am actually recording this video right after preaching my sermon on October 13th. And in that sermon, I said, justice, biblical justice, is wanting and working for the same life of blessing that God has given to us for all of our neighbors. Biblical justice is wanting and working for all of our neighbors to have the same life of blessing that God has given to us. Now, that blessing seems to disappear when we continue to read the ending verses of chapter 7. Now, if you read these verses in advance in preparation for this video, you may be waiting for me to address one of the most difficult parts in them, the final 3 verses of chapter 7. Now I find woman more bitter than death. She is all traps. Her hands are fetters, and her heart is snares. He who is pleasing to God escapes her, and he who is displeasing is caught by her. See, this is what I found, said Kohelet, item by item in my search for the reason of things. As for what I sought further but did not find, I only found one human being in 1,000, and the one I found among so many was never a woman. But see, this I did find. God made men plain, or level, or sensical, but they have engaged in too much reason. Now, I know it is tempting to hear these verses and default to explanations of context and culture. It is easy to point out that the world of the Bible was defined by patriarchalism and male superiority. We might suggest that women were of less importance than men in biblical days. They were considered property and didn't have the same rights as men. And that all has its place and its merit. But elsewhere in the Bible, even frequently in the patriarchal Hebrew Bible, the contributions of women are celebrated and necessary. We can point to women like Miriam, Huldah, Deborah, Ruth, and Naomi, and many others who served God and God's people in valuable ways. But these verses in Kohelet 7 are downrightly misogynistic. Woman is more bitter than death? Excuse me? Here, women are not only subservient to men, they are men's greatest obstacle. They exist to take men down. Well, it's important to note that Kohelet's misogyny is not unique to him. Misogyny is frequently recurring in Hebrew wisdom literature. For example, after the tragic lot that befell Job and his family, Job's wife implores her husband to curse God and die. And in the very next verse, Job's wife is condemned as a foolish woman and is given no redemption later in the book. And I think if we were honest, if we experienced the same thing that Job and his wife experienced, we might do the same thing she did. Likewise, the book of Proverbs is replete with misogynistic pronouncements. Proverbs 11:22, like a gold ring in the snout of a pig is a beautiful woman bereft of sense. Proverbs 21:19, it is better to live in the wilderness than with a contentious, vexatious wife. Proverbs 22:14, the mouth of a contemptible woman is a deep pit. He who is doomed by the Lord falls into it. And even the familiar and often cited virtuous woman of Proverbs 31 is only virtuous and praiseworthy because she is good to her husband. Never bad, all the days of her life. Plus, she goes to the city gates and praises her husband openly and publicly. In the apocryphal book of Ecclesiastes, or the wisdom of Ben Sirach, the misogyny only intensifies. 9:2, do not give yourself to a woman and let her trample down your strength. 25:15, there is no venom worse than a snake's venom, and no anger worse than a woman's wrath. 25:19, any iniquity is small compared to a woman's iniquity. May a sinner's lot befall her. 25:24, from a woman sin had its beginning, and because of her we all die. 42:14, better is the wickedness of a man than a woman who does good. It is a woman who brings shame and disgrace. Now, most biblical interpreters are disturbed by this proliferation of misogynistic thinking in wisdom literature, as well they should be. To our eyes and ears, this doesn't sound like wisdom at all. It sounds like chauvinistic foolishness, doesn't it? The target audience for Hebrew wisdom were young boys of nobility. They were from wealthy families who were afforded an education when education was a rarity. Nonetheless, these boys grew up to be men, elitist and chauvinistic just the same. It is unfortunate that these verses and others like them are still used today to propagate and advance misogynistic attitudes not only in the church, but also in society. As faithful and responsible students of the Bible, and as people of faith, we must not be dismissive of these terrible texts of Scripture and of the ways they have been used to support the subjugation of women for thousands of years. It is also incumbent upon each of us to be faithful students of the Bible in such a way that uplifts the inherent worth and dignity of every human being, and thus strive to live that fully in both church and society. So what's left? Observations, warning signs, more observations, maxims, contradictions, misogyny. What's left in this section that could be worthy of our attention? Once more, Kohelet circles back to encourage us to enjoy life and all that it has to offer. In 8:15, I therefore praised enjoyment, for the only good a person can have under the sun is to eat and drink and enjoy themselves. That much can accompany them in exchange for their wealth through the days of life that God has granted them under the sun. And as for what we do not know or understand, Kohelet goes on to encourage us to live and let live. Verse 16, for I have set my mind to learn wisdom and to observe the business that goes on in the world, even to the extent of going without sleep day and night. Doesn't that explain so much? And I have observed all that God brings to pass. Indeed, humanity cannot guess the events that occur under the sun, for they try strenuously, but fail to guess them. And even if a sage should think to discover them, he would not be able to guess them. Enjoy life and let sleeping philosophical dogs lie. It seems like a strange encouragement at the end of 4 chapters of difficult, strenuous reflection. Why would it end here? It seems ludicrous, anticlimactic maybe. However, doing the work of difficult reflection might be one of the greatest contributors to our life's enjoyment. But how so? First, we see oppression, envy, loneliness, injustice, instability, and prejudice all around us. We have reflected upon it, including during our time together thus far in this study. And in doing so, we have acknowledged at every turn that there is always a better way, a way to rise above and beyond all of the chaotic instability, above all the we can witness and experience in this life. Second, following Kohelet's example, we continue to pursue, observe, discern, and explore what wisdom and meaning can mean for us uniquely as individuals. He has done that work for himself, and now he encourages us to do the same. The only way we can discover meaning in life is to live life. There is no greater teacher than lived experience, truly on-the-job training for this Hebrew sage and for us all. Thank you for joining me for these 2 recorded video lectures. I look forward to being back on Zoom with you next week.